You've seen his name on all the games, and he's been the director of most of them. Hideo Kojima is the focus of this little number here. Hideo Kojima was born in Setagaya, Tokyo, Japan in 1963, and apparently he moved quite a bit in his early life. It's also been stated that Kojima had to deal with death very early on in his life, but I haven't found anything more on that. Kojima has stated that he grew up as a latchkey kid, that is, someone who went to school and returned to an empty home because his parents were at work or just not there. After school, he would often watch TV and just look after himself. Being isolated this way left a lasting impression on him. Even to this day, Hideo Kojima has stated that whenever he travels and stays at a hotel, he'll put the TV on as soon as he enters the room just to deal with the feeling of loneliness. Initially, he wanted to be an artist or illustrator, but was often discouraged by societal views in Japan that favored finding safe and well-paying jobs. Also, he was discouraged by the fact that his artist uncle was suffering from financial difficulties. Eventually, he started writing short stories and began sending them to Japanese magazines, but nothing of his was ever able to get published. According to Hideo Kojima himself, many of his stories were up to 400 pages long, while most magazines wanted their short stories to be around 100 pages. Eventually, he gained interest in trying to make films with his friend who had an 8mm camera. While studying economics in college, Kojima started playing video games in his free time, mainly on the Famicom, which is the Japanese NES for those who aren't aware. Kojima has cited his two main influences to be Shigeru Miyamoto's Super Mario Bros. And Yuji Horii Portopia Serial Murder Case, which is an investigation adventure game that is considered incredibly influential in the visual novel genre. In his fourth year in college, Kojima pretty much set his path to join the video game industry, despite initial film ambitions. In 1986, Kojima joined Konami's MSX division as a designer and planner, but his ideas weren't really taken all that seriously because of his unfamiliarity with programming. Eventually, he got to release his first game, Metal Gear, in 1987 on the MSX, to critical and commercial success, and from here on, they seemed more open about his game ideas. Since going into detail through every game would take too long, I'll just go through them and bring up anything interesting. As I said, his first game was Metal Gear in 1987 on the MSX. His second game, released in 1988, was a graphic novel-style adventure game called Snatcher. His third game was released in 1990 on the MSX2, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, which was supposedly created because he hated Ultra Games' unofficial sequel, which he was uninformed about the development and release of. In 1992, Kojima helped remake Snatcher for the PC, which was later ported to the Sega CD, which is actually the only official English version. In 1994, Kojima designed Policenauts, a spiritual sequel to Snatcher and the game that seems to have a particular place in Kojima's heart. In his own words, he often calls Metal Gear a blockbuster movie series, while he regards Policenauts as his independent film. He would make repeated references to this game from here on. In 1998, Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation was released. That kind of speaks for itself. In 2001, Kojima helped make two games for the PS2, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, later being updated with Substance, and Zone of the Enders, a mech combat game considered mostly unremarkable, except for the fact that it had a demo of Metal Gear Solid 2. In 2003, he produced Boktai, The Sun Is in Your Hand, for the Game Boy Advance, the first game I have heard of that uses sunlight exposure as part of its gameplay. Also in 2003, Kojima helped produce Zone of the Enders, The Second Runner, for the PS2. Kojima produced Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes for the Nintendo GameCube, which is a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, and he directed Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater for the PS2, Boktai 2 Solar Boy Jango for the Game Boy Advance, and Metal Gear Acid for the PSP, all of these in 2004. In 2005, Metal Gear Acid 2 was released, another game which he helped produce. In 2006, he produced both Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops and Metal Gear Solid the digital graphic novel on the PSP, which is basically a graphic novel version of the original Metal Gear Solid. In 2008, Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots was released on the PS3, and he acted as writer and director. That same year, he also designed Snake's stage in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Kojima wanted Solid Snake in Melee several years earlier, but was too late in his proposition. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker was released on the PSP in 2010, and he helped produce Castlevania Lords of Shadow. He's currently working on the recently announced Metal Gear Solid 5, which is supposedly influenced by Deus Ex Human Revolution, and he's an executive producer on Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. He also happens to be attending University of Southern California. That's a weird thought. Hideo Kojima always gets interesting opinions out of people, but here's mine. He definitely seems to understand that video games are a new innovative platform for storytelling and compelling an audience. But of course his biggest problem is the fact that he doesn't know how to tell a story without ranting. His games that garner the least amount of negative press are the ones that are inherently uninteractive, such as Snatcher and Policenauts, where all that's really asked of you is patience to let the story progress around you. I've never actually played Snatcher or Policenauts, so I can't really judge them as stories, but a visual novel game fits his bill a lot better than a stealth game with shooting parts. I'm not going to say cutscenes have no place in video games, but if they're going to be your main narrative tool, it should not be longer than the time the player spends actually playing the game. Hell, I may not be a pro at this, but your player should at least be an active participant for at least 90% of the time, and they should feel like they're actively moving the story ahead by means other than just fighting the battle somebody else starts. Story can be a great way of enforcing meaning into your actions, but they shouldn't take this long to establish. I know he loves movies, but games aren't movies. They're games. They're an interactive medium. Also, button mashing scenes are not a great way of endowing meaning onto players' actions. It just reminds you that you're holding a piece of plastic in your hands and are now being tested on something that has nothing to do with the game you are playing. It kind of says a lot when Kojima would send 400-page stories to magazines asking for 100 pages or less. He never seems to realize that you only have to tell the audience what they need to know, and that reinforcing arbitrary plot points should be secondary. A good example is in the original Metal Gear Solid, when he goes to such lengths to discuss the problems of nuclear waste, instead of making brief statements that could get the message across without needing to go into specifics. He even sometimes has the problem of not even knowing what to show. Peace Walker is a great example of this. Instead of fleshing out people who became war victims, he just shows you war victims and then fleshes them out in the optional areas, making the whole thing feel kind of manipulative. Now, I will say, Kojima does have his strengths, obviously. He knows what to do to compel you into getting involved into a mystery, and his humor can be really funny. His style is pretty unique, too, and I like his take on mixing scientific with the mystic. In spite of how I may criticize him, the original Metal Gear Solid is actually the best bit of storytelling I have seen out of him, since he actually has to be as concise as possible with the dialogue, and as obtuse and as harmful as it may be to the gameplay, the fourth wall breaking bits give you the impression that you should ease up on any seriousness. Again, my big problem from Kojima comes from excess reinforcement of things that aren't important. There's always so much time dedicated to reinforcing realism that it undermines how stylish a lot of his stuff can be, while also feeling as though it's making fun of those who are willing to suspend their disbelief to enjoy them. Metal Gear Solid 2 and 4 have a lot of these moments. It's interesting that for a guy who deals with the problems of a lonely childhood, he's never actually directly tackled this subject, even though it's probably one he actually could know what he's talking about. Perhaps this could be the explanation for why Otacon gets attached to anything that doesn't have a set of balls, but it doesn't deal with the issue I think he could tackle really well. I actually think he needs to get away from the Metal Gear Solid series. His attempts at creating new characters and stories and relating them to old characters and stories is just getting ridiculous. Supposedly, Konami wants Kojima to work on a new Silent Hill game. I think he would make a great consultant, but not a good game designer. Feeling alone is a powerful mood in horror, and certain visual cues can really bring that out. I just wouldn't want to see a 10-hour cutscene justifying why this is connected to Harry Mason and James Sunderland. Man, this one's going to be difficult not to spoil anything. As a compromise, I'm not going to talk about things that ultimately impact any of the game's story. Anything I discuss is simply details that characterize certain people. Nothing that ultimately impacts events in the games by much. Ocelot was born during the Allied invasion of Normandy, France on June 6, 1944, when his mother, the boss, was wounded on the battlefield and forced to give birth with the worst C-section ever. Shortly after his birth, Ocelot was taken from his parents by agents of a group. By around 1960, Ocelot would serve under Colonel Volgin's command in GRU, gaining preferential treatment within the organization because of his heritage, and even being promoted to major with command of a personal squad by the time he was about 16. After that, nothing really concrete until Snake Eater. After that, Portable Ops. After an unspecified amount of time, he participated in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a member of Spetsnaz GRU. During this time, he earned the name Shalashaska by the Mujahideen for his reputation as a sadist. At some point, he also ended up working in the Soviet Union's concentration camps as a special torture advisor and was known for using hidden prisons underneath the KGB headquarters to hone his training for interrogating his victims. After that, well, this game. Ocelot acts as the long-term mystery character of the series, and he was actually my favorite for quite some time. I always like characters where you don't quite know what they're up to, and that can be intriguing enough to drive other stories. The problem with this sort of character is that the more mystery you build around them, the greater expectations are when the mystery is revealed. And when that happens, much of the character's mystique, as happened to Ocelot in Metal Gear Solid 4, is gone. You could argue the main Metal Gear Solid series is about Ocelot and not Snake. The problem with Metal Gear Solid 4 was that this is where much of the focus should have been on Ocelot, and instead it was on Snake and the previous histories of the characters he and Ocelot knows. In the Twin Snakes version, there are a few changes to him. Apparently, this version of Ocelot has incredibly bad pain receptors, because it takes him like 10 seconds for him to realize that he just lost his hand, and apparently he lost all the dexterity he had in his left hand in Metal Gear Solid 3. His voice actor in English is Patrick Zimmerman, originally under the alias Patrick Lane. His Japanese voice actor is Koji Totani. Koji Totani sounds like any older character you've seen in an anime. Really, I actually looked at all his performances because his voice sounded so familiar, but nothing really jumped at me when I looked at it. He does a good job, but he doesn't have much of a presence with his voice. Patrick Zimmerman is honestly not that good of a voice actor in this, but his voice does have that proper gruffy sound that screams experienced old-timer. He had a little more enthusiasm for his actions in the original game, but the slower voice style retroactively fits very nicely with what his character eventually becomes, because it feels more like a conniving backstabber with a hidden agenda. It's difficult to say what's missing from his performance, but it just doesn't feel whole to me. Koji Totani's other roles include Jagi in Fist of the North Star, Kurikington in Dr. Slump, Detective Goburagai in Kinnikuman, Capricorn Shura in Saint Seiya, and as Alpha A Bait in Mobile Suit Gundam 0083 Stardust Memory. Patrick Zimmerman isn't a particularly well-traveled voice actor, but he plays Tyke in the Tom and Jerry Kids cartoon, and apparently he had an appearance in the live-action movie Strip Teaser. Interesting fact, Patrick Zimmerman's ex-wife, Chris Zimmerman Salter, was the English voice director of Twin Snakes and Guns of the Patriots. Revolver Ocelot has appeared in 5 games.